Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy here at EPCC.
And my name is Jules Simon, and I teach philosophy and practice as a philosopher at the University of Texas, El Paso.
Today we are going to be discussing what is dialogue for our namesake, Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. So we'll be learning more about what dialogue may mean.
By way of the marvels of technology, we are very happy to have Dr. Hernando Estévez interviewing with us today from Colombia. First, we'd like to begin by sharing some of the impressive work he has already done as a philosopher. After completing his PhD at DePaul University, Professor Estévez joined John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the U.S. as a philosopher, and is currently chair and professor of the Department of Philosophy, Arts, and Literature, and former dean of the School of Philosophy at Universidad de La Salle in Bogotá, Colombia. His areas of expertise are in Latin American philosophy, political philosophy, and contemporary philosophy. As former dean of the School of Philosophy and Humanities, he used his administrative position to maximize opportunities for the students, faculty, and staff to practice the art of dialogue, our topic for this interview. He did so by promoting academic excellence and innovation, scholarly activity, service, and faculty staff professional growth and development. Created and supported strategic partnerships and collaborations with academic and community institutions, as well as provided effective leadership in implementing the mission and strategic plan of both the university and the school. Dr. Estévez is the editor of and contributor to Teaching to Discern, Forming Connections, Decolonizing Perspectives, and is editor of and contributor to his forthcoming collection of essays, Philosophizing the Americas, an Inter-American Discourse. Besides publishing those books, I'd like to mention 4 other articles that Dr. Estévez has published, which show his intention for engaging in dialogue in a variety of ways in his professional and public life. First, Philosophical Contributions for a Woman's Agenda Within Peacebuilding in Colombia. Aportes filosóficos para una agenda de mujer y construcción de país en Colombia. The Image of Difference for Contingencies del Lenguaje. Challenging Corruption in Latin American Politics in the UC Davis Journal of International Law and Policy, and a forthcoming article on violence in Colombia, General and Always Provisional Conclusions. The first question then, I mentioned dialogue a few times when I was introducing you, and you had some time to think about this and you sent us back some initial reflections. So what is dialogue for you, from your perspective in Colombia?
Well, first, before I continue, I want to thank you for the invitation, and thank you for being part of this very interesting initiative that definitely creates more dialogue, because that's the whole purpose and intent of actually presenting this to an audience, to the public. So that's one invitation that I thought it was very, very interesting, that I think that also contributes to some of the work that I do, not only in philosophy, but also on the concept of dialogue and the importance that has for democracy, especially in Latin American countries where we're still trying to create more spaces for inclusion, for dialogue, for recognition, and for participation. So I think that this is an ideal venue by which we can create dialogue, not only among the 3 of us, but also with the people, the audience that we will see the program.
You're helping us to show that this is happening in other parts of the world as well, in very good ways. So thank you.
Exactly. No, thank you, and thank you, Kim.
Thank you for joining us. So I know you think deep thoughts about this, and this is, the little bit of time that we have together won't be enough, but we can just at least start grazing the surface. So what would you say to that answer? What is dialogue? Why is that so significant?
The first thing that I have to say is that as a philosopher, someone that was trained in philosophy, my first encounter with the concept, with the philosophical concept, is of course through the dialogues of Plato. And although that was when I first started philosophy, and of course did my master's degree and my doctoral studies, we always referred to the dialogues of Plato. And I will talk about more exactly what is the contribution that he does. I think it's important that through other dialogues, we enhance the comprehension of the ways in which dialogue constructs community, but it also constructs a sense of subjectivity. So let me put that a little bit into context. As I mentioned, when one studies philosophy, it is impossible, of course, to skip the work of Plato and the work of Aristotle and Greek philosophy.
Though some have
But
tried.
later, what's that?
Though some of us try.
Exactly, and I think that some of us are successful in in not forgetting, but also using dialogue as Plato as a platform by which we can then understand other ways in which we can understand the concept of dialogue. And when you send me the questions to begin to address the concept of dialogue, my first way of interacting with the concept was to also look for not alternative discourses that talk about dialogue, but most importantly, alternative ways in which we can comprehend the use and the applicability of the concept of dialogue. And of course, for Plato, dialogue is a way in which we can find knowledge, we can find truth, truth in the sense of the Greek philosophy in a universal manner, something that nowadays can be questioned because I think with different kinds of traditions and different kinds of dialogue that we have with other philosophers, we understand that dialogue has a different intent. But it's also a way in which we can not only unfold our own subjectivity, but we can also enhance our understanding and our own identity. So I think that regardless of which tradition we're looking at and which definition of dialogue we're using, I think dialogue is not only an incredible tool, but it's something that is endemic to the human condition that allows us then to interact with others, but also to know the other, in other words, right? So I think that this is very important because it's not only about dialogue to understand and to comprehend and to know, but it's also the objects of the world or to understand reality. But it is also to interact with other subjectivities, which in itself allow us to know who we are, and then this contributes to our own identity as human beings. So it's a practice. It's a practice that brings awareness. It's a practice that brings also a set of values and a set of emotions that are very important: compassion, understanding, humility. All of these things, I think that they arrive through, or they emanate from the interaction with other individuals through a dialogue, right? Dialogues that are not only verbal dialogues, like the one that we're having right now, but also dialogues through writing and reading. That's another way in which we can talk about. We can talk about in a little bit about what it means to read somebody else's work, to read a novel, to dialogue with a written word.
On that line of thought, I was teaching Aristotle's book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics today and raised the question to my students, like, with whom is Aristotle in dialogue in his text? And at some point in the text he says, well, there are the masses who understand this way, and there's we philosophers who understand this other way. Right? So it's important to distinguish. There's philosophical forms of dialogue, and then there's dialogues that we enter into with other people in different kinds of medium, like using the medium of this TV show, to get into dialogue in different ways with you, so we can reach our audience, our greater public audience. But there's literature and arts, and there's different forms of getting into dialogue. So let me ask the next question on our list. And I mentioned this in the introduction too, how I could see the potential for dialogue in the works that you've been developing, especially in some of your recent works. But how would you characterize your work in terms of dialogue? Your work as a philosopher, as an administrator even?
As a philosophy teacher, dialogue is always present in the way that we communicate with the students, right? I mean, this is something also from Plato, but also we begin to question that kind of maybe we can call it like a passive way of communicating, right? And I'm very influenced by the work of Paulo Freire in terms of understanding the role of dialogue in the classroom and a way of creating a community of inquiry. I think this is very important. Also, the work of bell hooks, for example, is something that comes to mind when we think about the concept of dialogue. Because rather than just simply dialoguing with the students through a content, which is also very important when we think about the notion of dialogue, is that the content of the dialogue is always the medium by which we can then interact with the students, right? And this is where teaching and knowledge and understanding kind of occurs. But I think that we also have to remember that regardless of the dialectic, the relationship that could exist between, or that actually exists between teacher and student, when we consider the other as another that can also contribute to the dialogue and the content of what we're teaching, something happens with dialogue. Dialogue no longer is simply a one-way manner in which we can then communicate certain content, but the way in which we can perceive and understand the other person shifts the way that we understand the purpose and the intent of dialogue. So in my work, I try to, of course, always to maintain a dynamics within the classroom. We're always trying to interact with the students, but also validating and paying a lot of attention to the experience and the knowledge that the student brings into the classroom. Although it's not the content of what we teach, his interaction or her interaction with the dialogue, of course, will promote in a very progressive way an understanding about that topic or theme that we're discussing. So in my work as a teacher, in a way that we can recognize and we can validate and we can celebrate the knowledge and the experience of the other, this is something that then contributes not only to the dynamics of the classroom, but also contributes to the dialogue itself, that after all, it develops from a tension that exists between different opinions and different perspectives. But that kind of tension, if it's done with certain principles, it can then not only engage in a deeper and more profound way, the kind of dialogue that we're having, but most importantly, what we do is we can continue the dialogue. In other words, the dialogue never ends. And I think that I take that kind of idea when I think about my role as administrator, as chair of the department with my colleagues, which is a different, it's a different kind of dialogue, because of course there's different kind of interests and different kinds of aims or intentions of the dialogue. But I think that it's very important to be very clever, be very clear about the principles that must govern that kind of dialogue. And this is something that I think it's very important. It's one of the questions that you ask when you send me the questions about the ethics of dialogue, right? The principles by which we can then create and maintain a sense of dialogue that should never end, because of course the dialogue is not with the intention of silencing the other or convincing the other, but there's ways in which that dialogue can be preserved for future reference in different kinds of contexts, right? So creating a community of inquiry for me is very important. And I think that here we're talking about two philosophers, two intellectuals that have influenced my way of understanding, bell hooks, for example, and Paulo Freire, which are very interested in their writings and their studies to promote that kind of dialogue that not only recognize the other, but it also recognize myself in the dialogue. And there is something that happens in that instant that I me to recognize the other as another I, if you want to put it in those words. So this is something that from the philosophical work of teaching, that's something that we do when we teach philosophy and we teach the content, that it goes beyond the classroom, that it moves into the administration, or it moves into the practical aspect of the administration, and that it's hope that one day will move, and I think it does, moves into the public sphere that's another space where that dialogue is so important, right?
I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here, because obviously I believe in dialogue, but I could see someone saying, you know, maybe this is like, it becomes too much like analysis paralysis, right? Where you just, and I noticed one of your publications was precisely about that. It was like inconclusive conclusions, you know, because it's in the process, right? But we still need to act, right? So like if you think in terms of parents and children, or teachers and students, or administrators and faculty, or government and citizens, right? We don't want to be in dialogue so much, right? It's like, look, I need you to help me with the dishes, and this is your homework, and you may need to delegate, and this is what we need people to do, rather than, well, let's discuss this. So why is being in dialogue important, right? So what is the significance, and what are the ramifications of being in dialogue with another person? I mean, because you could talk until the cows come home, but we still need to get certain things done. So wouldn't you say that maybe too much dialogue becomes analysis paralysis, and we may end up not doing things? Wouldn't it be, what is a good thing about being in dialogue, about engaging in dialogue with your students and children, parents and children, and couples being in dialogue with each other, instead of the husband telling the wife, you know, this is what I need, or the other way?
I think there's another question, or another category that kind of arises from the concept of dialogue, and that's the notion of power, and the notion of authority, and the notion of legitimate authority that one can have in front of somebody else, right? So the three of us here have certain kind of legitimacy in terms of we're intellectuals, we are professors, we have certain degrees, and therefore we have certain kind of power in the sense of the recognition that we have, because we know about these things that we're talking about right now. So now our dialogue, the dialogue that is occurring right now, it's a dialogue that is trying, and I hope it's accomplishing that, providing some understanding about the complexity of what the concept means, right? But I also think that there is other contexts that define the forms in which we can do certain dialogues, right? So usually in a dialogue, there is an intention. The intention is to, and that's the difference between dialoguing and conversation. We can have a conversation about something, and we can have a dialogue about something. And I think that this is where philosophy and linguistics are so interesting, because in that kind of distinction, we can literally comprehend what are the reach, or the way in which we can comprehend the notion. So in a given conversation, we do so for the sake of just unfolding or telling or describing or sharing with somebody else the events of our lives, right? And that happens every day in the everyday life. But when we think about a dialogue, when we engage in a dialogue, there's a different kind of disposition of the intent and the meaning and the telos, if you want to put it, the intention of the dialogue. And usually with dialogue, we want to get to a conclusion. And I think that there is a difference between power over and power within. Actually, that's the distinction that I would like to address, because it is precisely in dialogue where dialogue takes a different form. When you think about power over, you use your power to convince the other simply because you hold certain kind of power, right? That's it. And in the relationship between father and son, or mother and daughter, or in the family, or when you think about legislators and citizens, there is usually certain kind of legitimacy of the discourse that you are sharing with others that brings that power and legitimizes the content what you're trying to convey. When you think about power within, you are being persuaded because because the dialogue in itself allows for that kind of persuasion. because then you're empowering. Empowering is a tricky word, but there is a power within the other that allows him or allows her to convey, to communicate, and to be convinced, not because of the power, but also because of the persuasion of the dialogue itself. And this is very important, right? Because of course, the purpose of dialogue is not to be to convince the other and for both parties to be in agreement, but is to actually maintain the dialogue and maintain a certain sense of interaction that allow us to make decisions without the other person feeling like he or she doesn't have any power or feels fear from the dialogue that you have. That's called violence, and that's where that's a different way in which we can interact with people, right? I mean, we can persuade, we can commit, but we don't have to exert our power to violate the other person. And I think that that's where the paralysis will never happen, simply because the other person always knows that there is a possibility of coming back to the dialogue, to being able to engage with the other person, knowing that there always a space for more dialogue, but decisions have to be made. And the reason I brought the Center for Nonviolence is because it's a place where all decisions were made collectively, and we had a system of voting when it was a matter of making decisions, of voting 1, 2, 3, in the sense that 1 means I'm convinced, 2, you need to explain more, 3, we need to engage in more dialogue. And the question that you raised, Kim, is very important, because it will take us sometimes 25 minutes to decide who's going to take out the trash at the end of the day. And sometimes we have to say, Hernando, please, you take the trash, because this is the time you're going to do it, and next week somebody else will do it. But that's because the dialogue, we're able to continue the dialogue. That makes sense. We're able to continue the dialogue in the decision making that we're making as a collective. But the primary idea is that the collective has to happen. The collective has to engage in the dialogue, and we have to be able to recognize dialogue within the collective, and we have to be able to make sure that every participant of that collective has the opportunity to engage the dialogue and to make decisions collectively. So when we think about these notions of dialogue, we can't forget that there's other principles and virtues and practices that make the dialogue possible. Otherwise, we'll be simply talking about demanding from someone, making a requirement of someone that, of course, will immediately hindrance the possibility of that continuous dialogue. I think that dialogue is a continuum practice. It's not something that it's finished. This is some of the ideas that I wrote with a colleague in terms of the peace process in Colombia, because the peace process was not simply a matter of putting down the guns and stopping the violence, but it was a matter of an invitation to maintain a constant dialogue, which is the only way that we can preserve peace. The moment that we cease to dialogue with the other, that thinks differently, that is not in agreement with us, violence will have a space in which we can emerge and then can disrupt that community of inquiry, which is, I think, is the basis of all democratic systems and democratic practices.
Our previous interview guest was Gregory Pappas from Texas A&M. You know him. And he was also talking about dialogue and a community of inquiry, and it seems like you two are moving along very similar paths in the kind of work that you do. I don't want to talk so much about that other than to say that he'd be a good dialogue partner for you.
Yeah, I've known Gregory, and we have been in some conferences together through the Caribbean Philosophical Association. We're in those dialogues that I've heard from other colleagues. These kinds of ideas not only invite the work that I do, but also it gives me some insight about how to make the practice of philosophy, of teaching, of interacting with others in a more pleasant, amicable, friendly and more compassionate way.
Yeah.
So this is important.
Well, I wanted to ask about these virtues, that disposition.
That's what I was going to just talk about. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the disposition. So you've mentioned disposition a couple times. And so I'd like to push on that a little bit. And just because I have like Aristotle ringing in my brain cells now. So one has to have a disposition. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. The way you laid it out just now, the way you outlined your ideas, one has to have commitment. I have to have a commitment to this community of inquiry, a temporal commitment to stick it out. This is going to take time. It might take 25 minutes. It might take, a week or a month to work out some problems. So one has to give that time. So there's a commitment involved, right? And there's various commitments. But to get to that point, to make such commitments, one has to see the value in dialogue, right? Is there like a disposition that humans have? I think you said that earlier, that humans are dialogical, perhaps. Are we innately dialogical, or is that something that we learn and study and we can teach to our students or other members of our community?
Yeah, how would you describe that disposition?
This dialogical disposition, is it something that some of us are just good at?
You mentioned kindness. What else goes into that disposition?
Well, there's two ways that we can actually, or I can actually respond to the question, right? I mean, dialogue, of course, is endemic to the human condition. I mean, there's language, and because there's language, of course, there's a way of it we can communicate. But there is also something about the way in which we engage with the other person that is very interesting to me. And I'm going to speak about a personal experience of how this happens, or how I have learned to have this disposition. I mean, and it's not like a recipe that I can give, step 1, step 2, step 3, or nothing like that, because as Jules and Kim, you have mentioned also, there is a practice of how that happens, right? So personally, I think that the first thing we have to remember is that indeed the way that we understand the possibility of dialogue is by also a recognition of a human and universal condition, and that is very difficult. That is not easy to do. And I'm not saying that I'm an expert on those kinds of interactions, but I think that there is plenty of ways in which we can learn to recognize the other as another me, as another I, as another human being. And when that happens, all forms of dialogue are possible. The moment that I let myself be influenced or tainted by ways of power, social power, economic power, difference in sense of inequality, something happens with dialogue, right? Because no longer is dialogue, but I think there is also a way in which we can then see the other as inferior or superior, and therefore the dialogue gets there is an obstacle to the way that we can comprehend these things. I have learned how to practice this from different teachers, both men and women, that teach me how to dialogue. And I want to say this because one of the philosophers that have taught me how to dialogue, besides the concept of Plato and dialogue and truth and philosophy, is Thich Nhat Hanh, who actually passed away yesterday. And I was very sad when I heard the news, because I learned from Thich Nhat Hanh and from his writings to recognize the other within their humanity. And that's so important, because regardless of the social conditions, regardless of the economic, regardless of the different ways in which we have learned from the Western tradition to see the other as different, as inferior, to recognize difference we can recognize inequality. And I'm Lucy Arrigaray, and I'm talking about the tradition of feminism that emphasizes difference versus equality. And I think that that's very important. But also, there is a way in which when you interact with the world, and I'm not talking about in a economic commerce consuming way, but when you interact with others and you take the time to listen to other stories, other narratives, you also learn to dialogue. In other words, before you can dialogue, you have to listen. And that sounds very simple. That sounds like it's common sense. But I think it's not that common sense sometimes. To learn how to listen to the other is also a way to recognizing that the story of the other is also another story of humankind. And when that happens, all these principles of the disposition, all these principles of humility, of compassion, of understanding are possible. Otherwise, you engage in a dialogue that has the intent of oppressing, dehumanizing, controlling. I don't know other word I can use to express that kind of relationship. So the dialogical disposition, I think, is something. It's something that is both innate and is also learned and is practiced. In other words, it's innate for us to dialogue, but we learn how to listen and to engage in dialogue with the other. And I think that this is where conditions, social conditions, historical conditions, cultural conditions are so important. And they're important precisely because we learn how to imitate and how to practice and how to model ways of dialogue. And I think this is the reason why I like to be a teacher. I don't know if I'm a good teacher or a bad teacher. I don't know that, but I like to listen to the students. I like to dialogue with the students, and I like to dialogue with the content that I share with the students. And this is for me is the joy of teaching and engaging with others, because in order for me to teach and to convey certain content, the first thing that I need to do is to listen to my students in the same way that I listen to my friends, or I listen to my partner, or I listen to my family, or I listen to the person that is walking in the street, because their narrative, their discourse and their story is also part of the story of the humankind. And I don't want to romanticize this practice because it's difficult. It's difficult and it's easier. And I think the ways, the culture in which we live, and I'm speaking about, well, we know that in the United States, for example, right now it's polarized between ideas and ideologies and ways in which we can see the future, we can see the present, we can critique or make judgments about the past. But if there is that space of dialogue that recognizes the other as a possibility of understanding humanity, I think that there is something there that happens that is very powerful, and that it brings those kinds of virtues or those kind of values that makes dialogue happen. So to respond to your question, that disposition, that dialogical disposition is endemic, but it needs to be practiced. And I think that that's where we can speak about from theory to practice or something like that, right? From we can, and we need to have models in terms of way, people that teach us how to do this. And we as teachers, in the way that right now we're modeling a way of communicating, of dialoguing with the three of us and with the audience that is also looking at this video and engaging also by reflecting, by thinking, by I don't know, doing all kinds of interactions in the way that we're presenting these kinds of things.
Yeah, let me follow this up a little bit because and riff off of something that Kim said. You know, at the end of the day, the garbage has to be taken out, right? And things have to get done, right? And perhaps we're in a dialogue so that we can get to that point where we figure out what has to get done, right? So there's that element. There's that element of being in a community and being with others, knowing that there's work to be done in the world, right? But then I was listening carefully to you. I was following your teaching here, Hernando, about listening carefully, and recognizing the common humanity in another. But what I heard from you is, I like doing this with my students. I like doing that, and I like doing this, and this gives me a joy of teaching and doing and listening to them and listening to their narrative. So I think in dialogue, it seems to me what you haven't been saying, but what seems central to it, is there's a certain joy and enjoyment in the dialogue itself. There's something about just that connection of being in a dialogue that's worthwhile and joyful in itself, knowing that I'm connected to another human, another subject who is like me but not me, right? Another who's different than me, right? And I get to, see the prism of their life, so to speak, by listening to them, but enjoying that. And I have in mind, people like Levinas and Rosenzweig, and there's this line I like from Levinas's work is, I live from my work. I enjoy. My enjoyment comes from my work. And similarly, my enjoyment, or your enjoyment, our enjoyment as teachers, comes from that kind of work in being involved in, but also promoting these forms of dialogue.
I'm gonna take it from joy to the hardship because not everybody enjoys being in dialogue, and I'd like to ask you, if it was always enjoyable, then we would maybe practice more dialogue, but not everybody knows or has had those examples. And so I'm wondering, what stops us from being in dialogue? If everybody has that potential, would it be that they just haven't had the right role models? And I'm wondering, what stops us, in your opinion, what stops us from being in dialogue with each other? And the other question related to that is, let me think about that.
Well, the good example here is the narco culture.
Can you be in dialogue with everyone?
So, indeed, there is definitely a joy in engaging in that kind of dialogue, right? The question that I was going to ask, and it's not a rhetorical question, but it's a question that we ask to the concept of dialogue, is when does dialogue stop being joyful? When does dialogue stop being something that we enjoy and we see as something that is, I don't want to say productive in the sense that it has a benefit, but I think that's when the distinction between conversation and dialogue is very important, right? And by no means I'm trying to say that conversations are not important, conversations are not joyful or insightful, but I think that the dialogue or the way that we interact with each other moves progressively from conversation to dialogue. And that's when I think that the use of the question, when we begin to question it, is when we begin to understand that there's certain conditions for dialogue, right? Because it's not always simply about reaching the truth or getting to a conclusion or making a decision. Sometimes we can converse about the most simple things, and we can enjoy the conversation, right? We can enjoy the conversation because not all conversations are dialogues, and not all conversations have to have an intent. We just simply engage and we talk and we share about how things are going. I think in English it's called like chit chat, like we simply just engage to say hello and to see how the other person is doing. So I think that and I make the distinction because that kind of interaction reaches different kinds of levels in different kinds of moments. But I think that regardless if we're in a conversation or regardless if we're in a dialogue, it always needs to be joyful. It needs to be enjoyable. Otherwise, and I'm not here claiming that every activity of human activity has to be pleasurable and enjoyment and happiness and so forth. But we as a collective, a society, know exactly how to engage in that kind of conversation. So I would say that regardless if we're in a conversation and a dialogue, there is certain kind of principles that has to occur. And the most basic one is respect for the other. I think that respect and admiration and celebrating where the other person is essential. It's essential for that kind of conversation or that kind of dialogue to happen. Of course, when the conversation and the dialogue moves to a different kind of level with a different kind of intent, some of the rules and principles also has to happen. So I would say that the question for me is not so much the conversation stops, but most importantly is when does the conversation stop being enjoyable? And I think it's when other principles begin to be practiced, right? When principles of recognition, of listening, of respect they're not there actually to be practiced. I would like to also quote Levinas when Jules mentioned Levinas a little bit ago, is that concept that Levinas has of the face to face, right? When we're able to look at each other's face to face, when there is a certain kind of transparency, of truth, of authenticity that happens in that kind of dialogue, right? Otherwise, we're simply conversing, we're simply engaging and exchanging dialogue. By no means I'm trying to say that conversations are not important. I think that they're very important. I can have a conversation with my father, but I not necessarily have to have a dialogue with my father about a specific decision or a specific way in which we can find certain truth about the reality in which we engage.
In a way, it's a little bit like exercise because, having an authentic dialogue sometimes may mean there are moments when it's not fun and it's not enjoyable, like when I have to bite my tongue to allow the other to express themselves fully, or making myself vulnerable, which may not necessarily be a joyful thing, but in order to be authentic and engage, right? But so it's a little bit like exercising, where the actual exercising is not it may be painful, but afterwards it's fun and it's good, and I'm glad I did it.
But I want to dig deeper here. We only have several minutes left, and I want to hear what you have to say about this, and perhaps you too, Kim. But so we've been talking about joy and enjoyment, and really working that phenomenon in terms of dialogue and how that plays. But in dialogue, and you talked about this, you mentioned this a couple times, there's different levels or different intentions, right? So in a dialogue, where does the moment, because all dialogue is not an occasion for joy, there's an occasion for, discomfort or whatever, like Kim mentioned, vulnerability, etc. But the moment of critique, the moment of criticism, and how do you see that playing itself out in a dialogue? Because it's a very important issue, because we find ourselves being critical of lots of things, and I don't want to be so critical that I'm going to lose my dialogue partner. But there are important issues like violencia and repression of minority groups and other stakeholders, right? That I would be in dialogue with, that will voice criticisms, or I might have criticisms to voice. And it seems like that has to play a central role also. in a dialogue. And you were going to
Yeah, and you
add
know,
to that?
related to that, I'm thinking again of Thich Nhat Hanh, right? And do you think that it's possible to be in dialogue with those that are oppressing us? Because Thich Nhat Hanh seemed to hold out the faith that we could. So it's similar to what Jules is asking in terms of like, where does the criticism come in, and at what point do you continue to give them the benefit of the doubt that if you put yourself out there, they will rise to the occasion, those that are of whom you're being critical of?
So I think that the notion of critical thinking, it seems to come to mind when I hear you both, when I hear you, Kim and Jules, because critical thinking it's also is the preamble to critical dialogue. In other words, if we engage dialogue in a critical way, there is something that already has happened in the dialogue, and I think that requires of a different kind of knowledge, different kinds of skills, different kinds of a way in which we can prepare that kind of dialogue, right? Because we're going to engage with a clear intention with that other person to dialogue, to critique certain narrative or to critique certain discourse. So when we think about critical thinking, or when we think about critical dialogue, we're thinking about a body of knowledge that already exists, that already is there. And I think that the relationship between the oppressed and the oppressed, and in terms of oppression, in terms of violence, if we do a critique of violence and a critique of oppression, we already know of a certain kind of content and practices that create that kind of violence, right? So we come prepared to engage and to rebuttal certain kinds of ideas and ideologies and principles. And that is more complicated than simple dialogue. I think that's when we engage into an argument. And an argument is also part of dialogue, of course, right? I mean, we're trying to literally persuade the other. We're trying to convince. We're trying to debunk or dislodge the ideas that this other discourse has. But I think that we have to maintain the rules of dialogue. And when I think about the rules of dialogue, I'm talking about the virtues and the values that we have talked about, right? Dialoguing with the oppressor, dialoguing with injustice, dialoguing with violence, it's very important. And I say this from and although I have to say this, I understand the conflict, the armed conflict and the peace process in Colombia. And I know that there is more than simply to dialogue about violence. There's more simply to dialogue about getting into agreement. Here we're talking about the works of Desmond Tutu, who also passed away some months ago or a month ago, and someone that taught us with Martin Luther King of how we can engage with those that oppress. We also need to be open to that kind of argument, to that kind of way in which we can understand and comprehend the reach of that dialogue. So it requires, and I think that's one of the questions that you and Jules sent me, Kim, is about the conditions for dialogue, right? The time and the space for dialogue. And I think that those distinctions have to be made because if we engage in an argument to convey, to think critically and to dialogue critically about certain issues, that's a different kind of dialogue. That's a dialogue that not only is there to convey certain ideas, to convey certain human experience, but it has the intent of questioning the basis and the argument and the pillars by which we that kind of ideology or that kind of content has been constructed. So that's when we think about principles that are higher and ideals that are higher than simply the means of the dialogue or the means by which we dialogue. but now we're talking about certain sense in which we can say, and this is where this gets more difficult, right? Because we're not talking about absolute truth. We're not talking about relativism either, but we're talking about certain universal principles that make human life better, that makes human life possible, and without romanticizing the concept where love is possible, love for the other person, love and respect and admiration for the other person is possible. So a critical dialogue requires of a critical thinking, and a critical thinking requires of an already body of knowledge that we already know that we're going to engage and we're going to try to comprehend in a way that then is conducive to a better life or a common good for all, right?
Yeah, actually,
I have to say that last question is a little bit tough.
It's thorny, but you came to it in kind of a blossoming, flourishing way by making love possible. That was a really nice rounding of the conversation. Can we get to the point where we make love possible? Loving each other possible. That was a nice way to end that's a nice way to end our dialogue today. Do you have any questions for us, Hernando?
It will be a great opportunity to think about that notion of critical dialogue. And I don't know if you have thought about that, because that requires of a different understanding, a different practice of what dialogue is in a level that it goes beyond simple enhancing understanding or communicating ideas or practicing or making decisions. Something that is something that I see that it was part of the dialogue that we have is the worry about the decision making, right? And I also, and I have to go back to Plato here, because there is no conclusions for Plato in the concepts of justice, in the concept of beauty, and so on and so forth, because that's precisely the beauty, literally the beauty of the dialogue, that there is no need to actually arrive to some specific conclusions or some universal static truths, but that the dialogue in certain notions, like the concept of justice, will continue to allow human beings to fully unfold our humanity and to maintain that continued way of understanding who we are. So I don't have any questions, and I don't want by that I don't mean to say that I don't have any questions right now. I should say that.
We'll carry on this relationship. I really appreciate the way that you captured some of the essentials that we wanted to get at when we raised the questions to you, including the ethics of dialogue. And I said you came to love at the end, but really, by turning back to Plato, you came to the aesthetics question too, right? The beauty of the dialogue, or the beauty of our humanity, right? Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Hernando.
The last one thing I want to say is that out of dialogue come friendships. And that's something that is incredibly valuable for me. And I want to thank you, Jules, my friend, and Kim, my friend, for the invitation, because only through that dialogue and that interaction, it's friendships can occur and continue to sustain, right? And that's the beauty of engaging with your friends about any kind of topic in which dialogue can occur. So thank you very much, and I celebrate again the opportunity, and I celebrate the initiative, and I hope that I continue to see more and more of this dialogue with other topics and on other themes that are so important nowadays. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hernando, for joining us today. Thank you to our viewers, our production team. And this has been Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera with Dr. Kim Diaz, Dr. Joel Simon, Dr. Hernando Estévez, joining us from Bogotá, Colombia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Join us
Hernando.
next time.